People are going to guess I'm going to say yes to that, but I'll say a bit of background before I get to the punchline. Clearly, the last crisis wasn't anticipated by the mainstream in economic theory, and I find if you read the literature of academic economics and central banks leading up to the crisis, they're actually triumphalists. They've finally tamed the trade cycle. So this is Bernanke making quite that point, talking at a panel in 2004, saying that there's been this moderation in cycles and volatility called the Great Moderation, and he said the sources are controversial, but he's willing to take credit for it. And saying, in fact, it was a welcome change in the economy. And in the OECD in June of 2007, and those who work in the financial markets, I assume agree with me, you date the crisis from August 2007 when BNP shut down 3 of its funds on August 9. So this is 2 months before the crisis began. Their attitude was the situation was better than they've experienced in years. Their central forecast was quite benign. A soft landing in the United States. Can you imagine a hard landing? Sustained recovery in Europe, strong job creation and falling unemployment. That's the vision they had. And then what actually happened was the cycles that Bernanke was seeing, where unemployment and inflation were declining over time, suddenly, bang, the crisis hits and unemployment goes through the roof and inflation turns suddenly into deflation. A fall from +5 to -2% rate of change in prices in America. So quite a substantial turnaround. Now, that's what they experienced. And after the event, they think, well, those are 2 separate events. The Great Moderation was one thing which we helped cause, which is wonderful, and the financial crisis came along, which some naughty exogenous shock caused, which we can't identify. So Bernanke, writing in 2010, was saying, what's the implication of this crisis for economic theory? And he's fundamentally an academic economist. And he admits that standard models, that like the new Keynesian one, it's called new Keynesian. It is new, but it's not Keynesian, okay? It's new Samuelsonian. Didn't predict the crisis and didn't include the facts of financial instability. So does that mean that it's effectively flawed or irrelevant? And he said the answer is a qualified no. And I simply love how self-serving this is. Economic models are only useful for the context in which they are designed, so they're not universal, despite what he taught you in the last week's lecture. Most of the time, serious financial instability is not an issue. Standard models were designed for that sort of time. So it's like a road map that works when there's a road. If you go off-road, there's nothing to help you whatsoever. And yet we're living in an off-road world. So he said they're part of the intellectual framework, these models that he's now defending, even after they failed to see the crisis coming, defending on the basis that actually helped cause the stability of the previous 2 decades or 3 decades. Now, to me, it's self-serving bollocks, but that's typical in academic economics. So I want to take another look at that data and include something that Bernanke left out, and all conventional theory does as well, and that's graphed on the right-hand side. That's the ratio of private debt to GDP, the black line. Now, that was doing something quite dramatic, going from, in America's case, 120% of GDP in 1997 up to 170% by the absolute peak after the crisis began. A dramatic increase in debt. Now, they don't think it matters at all. They don't think there's any need to include what the financial sector generates, which is fundamentally debt, into macro models. So what I've done here is I've taken that same inflation and unemployment data and I've graphed it over time, and the colour change is something I'll explain what it is in a moment, but this is the beginning back in the 1980s. You have the boost out to stagflation, and these period of cycles that then seem to be converging towards a nice equilibrium point of about 5% unemployment and 3% inflation, or 2% inflation, which they think is absolutely hunky-dory, and then bang, this blast out sideways, completely inexplicable. Now, this is a model that I've built of Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. You'll notice it's got the same basic pattern. Seems to be heading towards equilibrium, and then bang, apparently without warning, it blasts out there. But in fact, it's not without warning, because there's a third dimension to my model and a third dimension to the data that the Federal Reserve leaves out, and that's the ratio of private debt to GDP. And then if you include them, I think you can see my model is getting the stylised facts of that period fairly accurately. Diminishing cycles in employment and inflation, with rising private debt followed by a crisis. And that's precisely what this model generates. And that's Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. Now, people who haven't been lobotomised by a degree in economics, if you've seen Aditya Chakraborty's article on that front, that an economics degree is a £9,000 lobotomy, if you haven't been brainwashed by that, of course you'd expect economists to include money in their model of the economy, but they include neither money nor banks nor debt. And here is, again, Bernanke explaining why they don't. They're talking about the idea of debt deflation. He said, Fisher's idea of debt deflation as an explanation for why the Great Depression occurred was less influential in academic circles because of the counter-argument to Fisher's proposition that debt deflation, and read this carefully, represented no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to another group, creditors. Now, that's implying that when they go bankrupt, debtors pay their debts, which is pretty cool to begin with. But that's not the main thing I'm focusing upon here, because he said the only way you can get a macroeconomic impact out of debt would to have implausibly large differences in how in spending behaviour of the borrowers and the lenders. Now, the essence of this is what's called the loanable funds model of banking, and I've realised over the last decade just how important that is to maintaining the way the mainstream thinks about macroeconomics. And the basic idea, this is now a proposition from Paul Krugman, saying, think of it this way, when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. So he sees no relationship between rising debt and a rising amount of money. He said instead it's less patient people borrowing from more patient people. A typical childish way that economists think about the behaviour of banking. Now, the Bank of England did a brilliant job. I don't know how many of you have seen this paper, but the Bank of England, at the beginning of last year in the Quarterly Review, I think it was, published a beautiful article called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. It might as well have been a direct letter to Krugman and Bernanke and so on, saying, for God's sake, take banks seriously. They create money. You've left it out of your thinking. So this idea that loans create money and create new demand is something that's now, the Bank of England is aware of that. It's academic economics that's dragging the chain. And the logic of the mainstream model as to why they leave it out is they think lending is just between a person who saves and a person who spends. That's the whole idea. Banks are just intermediaries in the process. So if you model what they see going on, and you think about expenditure by three different people, impatient, patient and the shop, and this is the expenditure coming out of one of the impatient agent, and this is where the impatient agent spends, the impatient agent's borrowed B from the patient agent. Now that means the impatient agent's got B that they can spend at the shop, whereas in this case I'm showing the patient agent spending less on A and less on the shop as well. And overall this plus B here is cancelled out by that minus B. Now if you add up the column, the diagonals there, that's aggregate demand, as economists define it. And that's the loan. You have an increase in spending power for the impatient agent, but that's offset by the decreased spending power of the patient agent. The two cancel out. Well, that's the way they think. The real world, of course, is it's not a patient agent lending to an impatient agent, it's a bank lending to someone in the economy. And in that case, the bank's asset rises by the level of the loan and their liabilities rise by the level of the loan as well. So you have an increase in spending power for B, but there's no offsetting fall in demand. So the process of lending creates new money, and it also creates new demand and new income when that borrowed money is spent into the economy. So my way of paraphrasing all this is to say that demand and income are demand and income from the turnover of existing money, plus demand and income from new debt. And leaving out that plus is leaving out about 20% of demand during the peak of the bubble, and about minus 5% of the demand during the peak of the slump. So you have rising debt, you have increasing demand and income and asset prices, and falling debt reduces them. So that's why it's so important and so simply, obviously important to include banking sector, loans and debt and money in the dynamics of the economy, and you'll then find that the change in debt and the acceleration in debt explain all the factors that the mainstream can't understand. That includes the boom before the crash itself, and the ups and downs of asset markets.